Folks, welcome back to News One Now. On Saturday, we lost a true legend in our industry. George Edward Curry, longtime journalist, died of a heart attack at his home in Maryland at the age of 69. Many folks know George most prominently as the editor-in-chief of the award-winning Emerge magazine. Of course, a black monthly magazine that set the standard for lots of different other magazines. Many people remember the covers of Clarence Thomas, Kimba Smith, and so many others. But Curry also was a friend of this show, appearing on News One Now, as well as my previous Sunday show, Washington Watch. He was a native of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Of course, he was the second African-American ever hired at Sports Illustrated, then moved on to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then went to the Chicago Tribune, where he covered the presidential campaign of the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. while serving as a Washington correspondent. After that, he became the New York bureau chief for the Tribune and then chose to go to Emerge magazine. In 2003, he was honored as the Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. He then went on to work for the National Newspaper Publishers Association, known as the Black Press, running their newswire, also writing his weekly column, appearing in more than 100 newspapers nationwide. George covered anything and everything, and we're going to pay tribute to him right now. Joining us in studio, and our panel is Hazel Trice-Etney. She's the editor and publisher of the Trice-Etney Newswire. She worked alongside George there at the NNPA. Also, we have Spencer Overton, president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, as well as Lauren Victoria Burke, a writer for NBC Black. Also joining us is Clarence Page, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Chicago Tribune, as well as Kimba Smith, a young woman whose story George chronicled in Emerge magazine, who was in prison for decades for her involvement in a drug case. She was later, of course, released from federal prison. But I want to go to Hazel first. Hazel, you worked alongside George. Certainly it was a shock to those of us who knew him well of his passing on Saturday.
Absolutely. Denise Rolock Barnes called me because it was such a big rumor on Saturday evening, and I tried everything possible to disprove it, but it was around midnight that I got a call from Maynard Eaton at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who told me that it was in fact true, and that our George was gone. George was the quintessential journalist. He wasn't just the black journalist, but he believed in journalism, and he taught me how to be a journalist, and that is the one thing that he underscored, is that you are always first and foremost a journalist. Even when it comes to the civil rights leaders, applauding them, etc. No, don't applaud them publicly. You do your job, hold them accountable, write the story, and be the quintessential journalist that you must be, to hold not just black civil rights leaders accountable, but politicians across the board. He was a true teacher.
Lauren Victoria Burke, look, we ran to George covering many stories. You did as well. He was not someone who was shy about holding his tongue when he felt the black press was being dissed by black organizations or black elected officials.
Or the President of the United States. I mean, one of the things that George, of course, was trying to do is get an interview with President Obama. And I think to nobody's surprise, he wasn't able to get it because, of course, George would have gone in there and asked real questions, unlike some of the people who have interviewed the president, the endless talk show hosts and Charles Barkley and Steve Harvey and all that. And so George would have gone in and asked questions about HBCUs and poverty. And George wrote an article last January 2015 on HBCUs, and I think the title that he put on the article was, "Is the President Trying to Kill HBCUs?" And so that was something, obviously, that most journalists in this country, certainly very few African-American journalists, if any, would ever write anything like that. He was not interested in being buddies with the president, or he was not interested in being in the haze of, okay, it's the first black president, so I can't say what's really going on. And in an age of celebrity journalism and opinion journalism, he was sort of the end of an era of hard-hitting, fact-based journalism, even when he was writing an opinion piece.
Spencer Overton, look, you focus a lot on politics. George was very much a political animal. having a strong voice, speaking to those issues in the black press and setting the agenda was critically important.
Yeah, he was just critical for so many of us in our formative years here. You think about, Black Enterprise in terms of business, but Emerge was like our political magazine that was with us in a critical time in life. So, Joint Center is a black think tank. Emerge is the black political magazine. He shaped a whole generation of elected officials, policymakers, journalists, scholars. He certainly shaped me. I was certainly a fan, and later on I was so proud to be able to call him a friend. Obviously, you'll talk to Kimba Smith. He shaped policy. Now we're having a big sentencing debate in this country. We've already dealt a little bit with the crack cocaine disparity, but we're doing more right now. And black institutions, he was a believer in black institutions in terms of black folks trusting black institutions, and also the importance. Individuals come and go, laws change. He believed in black institutions.
Clarence Page, you were a colleague of George Curry's at the Chicago Tribune. There's no doubt, and I knew George very well. He was an unapologetic black man.
That's right. And he was also, he and I were contemporaries, both born the same year. This is quite upsetting for me. Our friendship goes back to the early 80s. And George was a very successful reporter at the Tribune. He got the scoop when Jesse Jackson decided to run for president. And it was a big headline story. And Reverend Jackson wasn't happy about that because he wanted to announce it in his own way. But George wouldn't wait. He got that scoop and ran with it. He had numerous stories like that. And he was also our New York bureau chief, which is no small job. And then he and I wound up in Washington, D.C., and both on the panel at BET, the old lead story program, which I always call the Black Man's McLaughlin Group. It was a great program, and George always had a great opportunity and took it to enlighten the rest of us to what was going on. That question about HBCUs. I remember thinking at first George was being a little sensationalistic about the federal government quietly trying to kill HBCUs, but looked into it more closely, and he was right. There was a very important story going on there, and that's the way George was, and he's really going to be missed by a lot of people.
Kimba Smith, America did not know about your story until it was on the cover of Emerge magazine.
Yes, and this is actually the cover, and George Curry meant so much to me, and my family and I are taking it very hard, just because had it not been for George making the decision to put my, for lack of a better word, nobody face on the cover of his magazine to talk about an issue that most black publications in 1996 did not focus on, this issue of drugs and mandatory minimum sentencing and conspiracy drug laws. So I was very grateful when George Curry decided to highlight my case, have it be a cover story. Reginald Stewart, who wrote the article, basically had to convince him that, hey, man, there's no way that I could cut this story down. So it was the first time ever where they ran like a 21-page article highlighting my story. And so, like everyone has mentioned already, George dealt with issues that sometimes people did not want to face or deal with. And so I'm very grateful. He's changed my life tremendously because of this story. I know it was because Black America jumped on board, just the Deltas, the Links, the National Council of Negro Women, a nation and a people that read this story, and it moved them to want to be a part of this Free Kimba Smith movement. But it wasn't about just freeing me. It was a movement about wanting to change the drug laws, and everyone hoped that my case would set a precedent. And here we are today, still fighting these same issues. So George was ahead of the game years ago, and I will forever be grateful to him and how he's inspired others to focus on stories that deal with real issues. That had it not been for this story, I would have served my full 24-and-a-half-year sentence. Instead, I served only 6.5 years of a 24-year sentence after President Clinton granted me executive clemency. Of course, more needed to have been done, but I thank George for what he did for my life.
Clarence, I got about 30 seconds before I go to a break, but I got to ask you this here. Folks, pull this graphic up, please. Emerge was the one, when they shut down Emerge, George was heartbroken. He never got over it. He carried it with him for the last 20 plus years. He was trying to actually relaunch it as a website. George, he sent this Saturday at 2:27. And it says, I've started raising money for support emergenewsonline.com. And I talked to his sister. He was there at home. He called his fiance, Ann. Said his chest was hurting. Where are you? She'd gone to get food. She pulled into the garage. She said, do you want me to call the ambulance? He said, no, I want you to take me. She took him to the hospital. They said he'll be fine. She went to park the car. They wheeled him in. She came back. He went to cardiac arrest. An hour later, he died. George, Clarence, he literally sent this probably right before he had a heart attack. He died with his boots on.
Right. That's George. You know, and this was something, this is not a new thing. He's had heart trouble for years. Back when we were both around 50 years old, he had an operation at that time, and he afterwards was every day he'd go out and jog for a couple of miles and really got himself in good shape. But he had an attack last year around the anniversary of the Selma March, and
right.
That was a bad sign. You know, each one weakens your heart that much more. So this time, I was just so shocked and disappointed that you know, he put up a good fight and lived a really active life and accomplished so much. And he has such a big heart, so it was ironic that it gave out on him in the end. And he was a great mentor. I got to throw that in there because he's been nationally recognized for helping so many young men and women to get started in journalism and give them guidance and all. So he believed in passing it forward. So he's going to be missed by a lot of people, and so will Emerge magazine.
Clarence Page, Kimba Smith, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot. When we come back on News One Now, we continue our tribute to George Curry, who's a friend of this show, was a personal friend of mine. And we'll talk with Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. We'll talk with Ed Gordon, who was the host of Lead Story. Both of them knew George Curry very well right here, News One Now on TV One.
What do you think about his appeal in the last two speeches to African Americans saying that they should vote for him? I've said very publicly, as you know, that I don't even think he's really appealing to African Americans. I think he's trying to make independent white voters think he's not racist. But how do you read this? And do you think, whether that's his objective or not, that some small fractions of blacks may be tempted to look at the reach out?
Well, first of all, he has not gone to a single black event except at that little black church that nobody knows of in South Carolina. He rejected an opportunity to speak to the Urban League and the NAACP and the black journalists, NABJ. Right. And even Ronald Reagan spoke to the Urban League before, and NAACP. So we won't even come there. And then he goes to Milwaukee, go out in the suburbs and talk to most of the white audience about black Americans. So he can't be serious about this. And he just think we're stupid if he just think, oh, what you got to lose? You got a whole lot to lose, and we're not fooled by it at all. We look at his record.
Yeah, his statement was, what do you have to lose to try something new? I mean, what is that supposed to mean?
I mean,
folks, that was George Curry on Friday on his weekly appearance on Reverend Al Sharpton's radio show. That was the last time George gave an interview. He appeared on Reverend Sharpton's show on a weekly basis. Joining us right now is a very good friend of his, someone who covered him, someone who ticked him off, someone who made him proud, Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., founder, Rainbow Push. Reverend Jackson, we are remembering our dear friend George Curry today, who passed away Saturday at the age of 69. Your most important thoughts about George?
Well, let me say first, Roland, I thank you for the call, and I'm still shocked. In the state of trauma, it seems to have happened so quickly. We talked just last week. George was smart, with integrity, Grew up, of course, in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and loved Knoxville College. Became Chandler Sports, fighting to save a HBCU school. And that first wave of journalists to cover the national campaign, he had all the tools and used them for the betterment of all of us. I'm just so grateful to George Curry for his work, for his legacy. I think most of all in the '84 campaign, when he was covering the campaign, and the white journalists began to attack the black journalists, and they were too liberal in their coverage. And he said, "You're challenging our integrity." It almost came to fisticuffs. George would not bow. He had an unwavering sense of dignity, and was just very able, Roland.
Reverend, one of the things that he also did, he challenged black institutions. I remember the National Urban League would often leak their State of Black America report to the New York Times or the Associated Press first before unveiling to everyone else. And George called them out saying, how dare you release that to white media, but you ignore black media?
Well, you cannot get how central to our thinking in that season of Emerge magazine. Overnight became like a flash flood of good news, Emerge. But George's weekly column in NNPA, I mean, his work stands for itself. He was a devotee, of the late Vernon Jarrett. Both of them went to Knoxville College. So George Curry, the reason you're getting all these warm expressions today because George meant that much to all of us, Roland.
But Reverend, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. We certainly know how close you were, and thanks for joining us for our tribute to George Curry.
Love you, buddy.
When we come back, we'll talk with Ed Gordon, who was the host of BET's Lead Story, where George Curry was a panelist for a decade. Our tribute continues to great journalist George Curry next on News 1 Now TV 1. We continue our tribute to journalist George Curry, who died Saturday at the age of 69. Joining us right now from Detroit via Skype is Ed Gordon, who was the host of BET's Lead Story, where George served as a panelist along with Dwayne Wickham and Clarence Page. Ed, certainly you recently had breakfast with George Curry. Certainly it's a huge loss for many of us who loved him.
Yeah, it's a tremendous loss, Roland. As you know, George was one of those voices that was unwavering for our community. And what I loved about George Curry is no matter who you were, he made a way for you. He was a trailblazer, and he wasn't afraid to share the spotlight. I remember when I first started in this business, George quickly became a mentor of mine. And in this business, it's hard to find those who are genuine and who really rally for you as your success grows. And so just thinking about the sudden loss, selfishly, it's a tremendous loss to our community with a voice that has done nothing but been outstanding and upstanding for all of us.
He had a deep, abiding love for black people.
He had a deep, abiding love for black people. Yet, as you mentioned in the last segment with Reverend Jackson, he took no quarters if black people weren't doing the right thing. He called you out. He made you accountable. He wasn't afraid that he wasn't going to get the next invitation to your party if he made you upset, if he felt it justified. And oftentimes that isn't the case anymore. And so, again, this loss, I think we're all stymied by the fact that not only was it so sudden, but those of us who know realize what we've lost on that front.
We certainly appreciate Ed Gordon, you sharing your thoughts and memories about George Curry on TV 1.
Thank you, Roland. Appreciate it.
When we come back, we're going to talk to our panel about George's commitment to young people. Next on News 1 Now. Back in a moment. Welcome back to News 1 Now TV 1. We continue our tribute to journalist George Curry, who passed away Saturday at the age of 69. I want to go back to our panel, Hazel Trice, Etney Long, Victoria Burke, and Spencer Overton. And Hazel, I'll start with you. George was a founder of the Urban Journalism Workshop in St. Louis. He also worked with similar workshops in New York, in Washington, D.C. He absolutely believed in paving the way and shaping the minds of the next generation of journalists.
Absolutely. When I worked with George for the 7 years that he was my editor, we were based at Howard University. And so I saw on the front lines, how he loved working with students. He loved teaching. Even after he left as editor-in-chief and I became editor-in-chief, he still came to my classroom. He worked with students, teaching them how to do interviewing. And he was a no-nonsense teacher when it came to young people. He didn't let them by easy. He was very hard, and some might think even very harsh. But the lessons that he taught were amazing, and they were lasting.
Spencer Overton, 2003. I'm at the National Association of Black Journalists Convention in Dallas. It's after 2 a.m. We have one of our parties at night, and I'm standing there with George and his fiancee, Ann, and several young students come up to me, and we're talking to me, and all of a sudden George jumps in the conversation, and we're literally having a discussion about work ethic and what these young folks need to do to prepare themselves to be journalists at 2 o'clock in the morning. George could have easily been in the bar with other journalists, could have easily been in bed, but he was there at a party, still talking to young folks at 2 o'clock in the morning about what it means to be a quality journalist.
Yeah. That was who he was. You know, last year I received an email from him of an email he saved. I sent it to him in 2000 talking about how I was so sorry about the loss of Emerge, and he kept that email. I mean, I was just reaching out as a fan. He didn't know me at all. We've kind of gotten to know one another over the past few years, but he reached out to me. I mean, he was really into young people and development, and again, there are just dozens and dozens of people who are right now in their 40s, their 50s, they're elected officials, they are journalists, they're scholars and professors at universities who are basically shaped by him in terms of work commitment, in terms of integrity, in terms of commitment to black people. And so, you know, his legacy is really significant in terms of all of the young people he touched.
About 30 seconds before I go to break, Lauren Victoria Burke, you heard Spencer talk about that email. One of the last letters that Senator Ted Kennedy ever wrote before he died was to George Curry.
That makes sense. You know, George, I was just during the break looking at some of the emails that have come in. Obviously, George had his, you know, he had his weekly email of columns, and the piece where George was so really concerned about black media ownership was huge. And like Hazel was saying, he was a really tough advisor, a no-nonsense person when it came to giving advice. And it was no like sugarcoating anything, which I really appreciated. He's very direct. He didn't waste any time mincing words. So obviously George will be greatly missed.
Many folks may be wondering why, for me, I got emotional here, and that is because yesterday, I called George's sister. First of all, I was made aware of George's passing around 9 p.m. Saturday night. We did, like Hazel said, many of us tried to make calls confirming it, did not want to believe it. But yet last night I was reached out on Twitter by a church member of his sister. They hit me up and they said his sister and his mother wanted to speak to me. His sister, Sue, got on the phone and she said, I just need to hear your voice. She started crying. And I was wondering why she was crying, and she said, because George talked about you so much. It was as if you were a brother. He respected you so much and respected him so much. And some people may wonder, okay, well, why would you spend this much time on a journalist? Because here's the reality. ABC, NBC, and CBS, they probably will spend lots of time when one of their journalists passes. For us, George was one of ours. Mm-hmm. George was in our family. George covered us. George appeared on this show. He brought us his wisdom, his intellect. George had a ridiculous sense of humor. But here's the other thing that's important. His fiancée, Ann, called me yesterday. And George had a love-hate relationship with his home state of Alabama. He vowed never to go back to Alabama. George Curry said he grew up with the racism of Alabama and despised what took place. But Ann told me that they often talked about him dying, and he said, when I die, you must return me back to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The family right now is working to get his body there. He said he must get there quickly. His funeral will be held in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a native of Alabama, as son returns home. So many of us will miss him. So many of us appreciate his hard work. We also thank him for his friendship, and I do as well. Folks, we always make sure here at TV One, we celebrate those of ours who pass away, their proper homegoing. And that's why we dedicated the last several segments to the great George Curry. We'll see you tomorrow.